Welcome back, and do settle in. Pillows arranged just so, the lights turned low, the day's small worries gently set aside. Tonight, we're going to spend some quiet hours together with a rather strange and wonderful book, Gideon the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir. It's the first of a series set very far in the future on a dying little world tucked deep inside a planet's bones, a place of black robes, painted skulls, and old, old magic. The people who live there are necromancers, you see, scholars of bone and death dwelling in a crumbling house that has almost forgotten how to be alive. And at the heart of it all is a young woman called Gideon Nav, who would rather be anywhere else in the universe. She has a sword, she has a stack of slightly disreputable magazines, and she has, by our last count, attempted to run away from home 87 times. Tonight we'll follow her through the pre-dawn dark of the Ninth House and into a wider story of locked doors, old grudges, and a peculiar kind of friendship that neither she nor anyone else quite saw coming. There's nothing you need to remember, and nothing you need to do. If you drift off somewhere along the way, that's perfectly all right. The story will still be here, and so will I. So take a slow breath in, and a softer one out, and let's begin, quietly, in the cold corridors of the Ninth House. We begin with Gideon Nav, 18 years old, preparing what will be her 87th attempt to escape the Ninth House. In the absolute dark before dawn, she packs her sword, her shoes, and her dirty magazines, sweeps her cell, and hangs up her great black church robe one last time. She unlocks her security cuff, sets it on the pillow with its stolen key like a chocolate left in a fancy hotel, and climbs the long way up to the landing field, where a shuttle she ordered through forged documents is due in 2 hours to carry her to the cohort, the Imperial military she has tried to enlist in 33 times. The Ninth House, you'll remember, is a vast hole cracked vertically into a dead planet's core, a place of skeletons and snow leaks and a bell that wakes everyone at dawn. Gideon checks every drift of grit on the landing floor for sabotage, eats grey porridge, and waits. Crux, the half-rotted marshal of Drearbur, arrives first, listing her crimes in his fondness for verbs, and orders her to a muster called by the lady. Gideon refuses, and tells him the lady can go to hell. He retreats. Then her swordmaster Ianthe arrives, the one person in this house who ever loosened her leash, and slaps her cleanly across the face for cursing the lady, warning her that the more she struggles against the Ninth, the deeper it takes her. Gideon shrugs and watches the clock tick down. Woven through all this is her origin. 18 years ago, a brain-dead woman fell down the shaft in a battered hazard suit, carrying a day-old Gideon in a biocontainer, and when the nuns finally caught her shade, she screamed Gideon's name 3 times and fled. Taken in as a bondswoman, Gideon has been trying to leave since she was 4, and now, with minutes to go, she believes she finally has. With only 5 minutes left on the clock, Gideon's escape is interrupted by Harrowhark Nonagesimus herself, 17 years old, dressed in black, and quite certain she has the upper hand. What follows is a curious negotiation. Gideon, hand resting on her sword, reveals her trump card. If Harrow tries to drag her back through official channels, Gideon will sing the Ninth secrets to anyone who will listen, the numbers among them. Harrow, to Gideon's genuine astonishment, then produces a real commission to the cohort on house letterhead, signed in her own blood under her mother's name, granting Gideon second lieutenant rank and freedom in 5 years rather than 30. She asks only one thing in return: that Gideon attend the muster meeting downstairs before leaving. Gideon refuses, even as she tucks the precious paper into her shirt, because she completely, magnificently hates Harrow and would rather lose any prize than spend 10 minutes obliging her. So Harrow proposes a fair fight, stripping off her bone bracelets, her teeth necklaces, her ear studs, every focus she uses to raise the dead. Win or lose, Gideon keeps the commission. Lose, and she attends the muster first. Gideon pats her down, finds nothing, and agrees. It is, of course, a trap. When Harrow peels off her gloves, her hands are filthy and bleeding. She has spent the entire night burying skeletons beneath the shuttlefield grit. The ground erupts in bones. Hands grab Gideon's boots, her ankles, her trousers. She hacks and runs, but there is no edge to the field. A tidal wave of reanimated skeletons crests over her, and Harrow's boot at last forces her down. With the shuttle landing nearby, Crux gleefully declares the fight a fair win for the Lady Nonagesimus. Harrow, bleeding from the nose and chillingly composed, orders the pilot to wait an hour on her grace and tells her marshal to drag Gideon down to the sanctuary for the muster she swore she'd never attend. Crux drags Gideon by the ankle down the lift and across the bottom of the tier, kicking her in the head when she tries to crawl away, and dumps her on a freezing forward pew in the long, dark sanctuary of Drear Burr. The ninth service has no spoken invocation, only the soft clatter of knuckle-bone prayer beads worked by veiled nuns, and the hall is mostly empty of people now, half full of patient skeletons. From her pew, Gideon takes in the full grim tableau of the house nobility on the apse bench. Harrow's two tiny blind great-aunts, Sister Lac Remortar and Sister Isa Mortar, pray two strings of beads at once. Audiobook, the lumbering primary cavalier, sits beside his fretful mother Glauri Car, and at the altar sit the Lord and Lady of the Ninth, Peliam Enna and Puriam Hark, untouched by age because, as Gideon has known since she was 11, they have been dead for years, mummified and puppeted by Harrow herself from a forbidden book she read at 10. Gideon has carried that secret all this time, saving it as her final card. Harrow rises in her parents' place and reads the Emperor's letter aloud. A summons for the first of the house and her cavalier to travel to the first house and compete to become lictor, the Emperor's saintly hand. The congregation gasps in joy, an old hermit obligingly dies of shock, and Glaurikar throws herself around Oartius, wailing that she will not give up her only son after she already gave up her husband. Crux silences her. Harrow leads a calm prayer over the locked tomb, and the muster breaks. Glamine returns Gideon's sword and case with rough, wordless apology. Then Harrow walks down the aisle, and Gideon, smug, accuses her of booby-trapping the blood-signed commission. Harrow only tilts her head. She hadn't even thought of that, she says. She meant the shuttle. Ortus and Glaurikar have already stolen it, fleeing to the 8th. Gideon kneels alone on the empty landing field, and Harrow tells her she did it for one reason only, because she completely hates her. After the catastrophe on the landing field, Gideon does not rise to the occasion. She simply sinks into her cell, the security cuff once again locked around her ankle, and lets a week pass in the dark. She picks at stolen nutrient paste, leafs through her magazines, crunches through sit-ups for no reason but to make the hours pass. The fight has gone out of her, at least for now. Then Harrow arrives at the peephole as Harrow always does, and when Gideon refuses to open the door, Harrow simply grows a skeletal hand from a single bead of her earring and turns the key herself. Down they go, into the freezing catacombs below Drear Burr, where Glamine is kneeling among 100 rusted swords, hunting for a blade and knuckle knife in the style of Ortius's great-grandmother. And here, at last, Harrow tells Gideon what she truly wants. Not to bring Ortius back. Gideon is to impersonate the primary cavalier of the Ninth, accompany Harrow to the first house, and stand at her side while Harrow studies to become a lictor, one of the Emperor's immortal saints. In exchange, freedom, a cohort commission, a fortune. Gideon laughs, then refuses, then levels the rusted blade at Harrow's forehead and tells her that her promises mean nothing, but it is Glamine who quietly turns the tide. The old captain, who has condemned Gideon's escapes for years, now formally vouchsafes her freedom on Harrow's behalf, binding her own honour to the pledge. And then, more gently, she warns Gideon of something new. The Ninth, she says, is no longer waiting for something. It is simply waiting to die. If Gideon does not leave now on these terms, she will not leave at all. Not even in a box. Harrow departs with the door left pointedly unlocked, and Glamine presses a case of swords into Gideon's nerveless arms, already counting the years of training they will not have. In the dim Nonagesimus library, surrounded by Harrow's musty necromantic books, Gideon sat painting her face with alabaster while rereading the Emperor's second letter. This one was shorter than the first, and one paragraph in particular caught her attention. No retainers, no attendants, no domestics. The two of them would be entirely alone with the other houses at the first. Gideon had hoped for somewhere lively, perhaps the third or the fifth or even a space station. But Harrow confirmed the destination was the empty First House planet, a place where nobody lived but a handful of crumbly hierophants. The con, Harrow explained, depended entirely on Gideon looking the part of a properly trained Ninth Cavalier. No two-hander, no breastplate, no bare face. If any other house suspected the Ninth was broke, nearly extinct, and that Harrow's parents were dead, they would be devoured. So Gideon would wear the ghastly full death's head paint of the ancient sages, the traditional robe, and the rapier Glamine had chosen for her. Harrow refused to share any intel about the trials ahead, and threatened, quite plausibly, to kill her if she broke cover. For 11 brutal weeks, Gideon trained 6 hours a day with Glamine, learning the rapier and offhand knuckle knife she'd never wanted. Each session ended with Glamine disarming her in 3 moves, scolding her for blocking instead of parrying. Crux enforced the paint by freezing her cell whenever she went barefaced, so she wore the death's head daily. Harrow, meanwhile, vanished into the library and into some secret task she'd set the elderly Ninth to in the bowels of Drear Burr. Eavesdropping during one tier walk, Gideon overheard Harrow confess her real fear. Not the soldier second, nor the politician third, but a greyer house, because anyone could learn to fight. Hardly anyone learned to think. Glamine reforged Oartius's great-grandmother's plain black rapier and obsidian knuckles for Gideon, judging her at last a bad cavalier, one who was terrible, which counted as praise. On the day of departure, Harrow lied calmly to the assembled house that her parents had sealed themselves behind the locked tomb to do penance, named Crux Seneschal and Glamine Marshal, and wept real tears through her paint. Gideon saluted her teacher, boarded the shuttle, and traded death threats with Harrow as they rose. After an hour aboard a remotely piloted shuttle with no crew, Gideon and Harrow finally arrive at the First House, a drowned blue water world wreathed in white smoke, the seat of the King Undying, who has not returned to his own home in over 9,000 years. Through the plex window, Gideon stares until her eyes stream, dazzled by a planet so bright it seems impossible the whole thing doesn't catch fire. Harrow, by contrast, ties black voile across her eyes, clinks her prayer knuckles and bites her painted lip bloody as she concentrates against the deep space drain on her power. Where Gideon sees something gorgeous, Harrow sees a grave. They land on a vast metal dock fronting a ruined palace of white and gold stone, its towers crumbling, its gardens grey and dead beneath filmy canopies, and 92 of its 100 shuttle cradles empty. A small, ageless, ramrod-straight priest in a jewelled belt greets them as teacher, welcomes Harrowhark Nonagesimus, and pointedly notes that her cavalier is not Oartus Nishganad. Harrow answers smoothly that Oartus has abdicated, naming Gideon as Cavalier Primary, and Gideon hears herself rechristened as Gideon the Ninth, a name she would pay cash to be called anything else. Only 6 shuttles are present. The 3rd and the 7th have been delayed for clarification. When the 3rd's hatch finally opens, Gideon sees the Tridentar Eos party for the first time. A sulky young man with hair gel and filigree, and twin blonde sisters, one statuesque and golden, one bloodless and butter pale, identical in height but somehow opposite in substance. The 7th's arrival is far worse. A slender young woman in seafoam green frills staggers out of her shuttle and faints into the buckling arms of an elderly priest, blood on her mouth. Gideon, who never runs unless she has to, runs now, scooping the girl out of the priest's grip, and earns a sword laid coldly to the back of her neck from the woman's cavalier Protesilaus. The girl, Lady Dulcinea or Septimus of Castle Roads, finds the whole disaster delightful, laughs through bloody coughs, calls Gideon a black vestal, and winks at her in apology. Harrow seethes silently. Teacher quietly explains that the 7th house carries a fatal blood flaw, and that Dulcinea was never meant to live to 25. Gideon, remembering the wink, feels suddenly and terribly sad. The 8 delegations are ushered into Canaan House's grand atrium, a vast wreck of a room where sunlight pours through cracked glass onto threadbare couches and a long, dry fountain. White-robed skeletons circulate with cups of bitter green tea, and 3 priests sit at the fountain's lip. Teacher, bright and curious, the other 2 ghostly and remote, as still as the skeletons themselves. The assembled houses pray together to the king undying, and teacher asks the devout of the locked tomb to offer their own intercession. Harrowhark, perfectly composed, drops her cup into Gideon's hands and recites the ninth's bewildering dirge, praying that the tomb stay shut forever. The other houses look bewildered or openly hostile, confirming what Gideon had only half suspected, that the ninth's faith is genuinely apart from everyone else's. Teacher then calls each cavalier forward and gives them a small twist of iron with a bent prong, a curious little ring whose purpose he does not explain. He tells them the lictors were made, not born, that 16 original acolytes ascended here a myriad ago, that the surviving 8 are dying, and that the Emperor has at last permitted replacements. There is no syllabus, no teacher, no instruction at all. Only one rule, gentle but absolute. Never open a locked door without permission. A skeleton leads the ninth to a wing deep below the dock. Gideon, refusing to sleep at the foot of Harrow's bed, makes herself a nest by a window, and from that window in the dark she watches the skeletons quietly push every visiting shuttle off the landing platform into the sea, marooning them all. Gideon wakes alone in the ninth's grand, decaying Canaan house quarters, in rooms once dressed in dark jewel colours and now sagging quietly toward ruin. The first thing she does is reach for her rapier, because Iglamine drilled that habit into her back on the ninth, training her painfully out of grabbing for the familiar two-hander. Beside her hand, she finds Harrow's first note, "Do not talk to anybody." And then, the dismal kicker that Harrow has taken the iron ring teacher gave her the night before. It is petty in the exact way Harrow always is, treating Gideon's possessions as her own, and it leaves Gideon with the small consolation that at least Harrow isn't in the room. She finds the cavernous bathroom, puzzles out the sonic cleaner and the water taps, scrubs the smeared paint from her face with antibac gel, and then discovers a fresh string of notes ordering her to repaint properly, stay silent, and not come looking. She repaints the death's head, slides on her dark glasses, and heads out as the cavalier of the ninth. In a glass-roofed dining hall stocked with eerily competent skeleton servants, she meets the first friendly face of the trial. Magnus Quinn, cavalier and seneschal of the fifth house, jovial and well-dressed, chaperoning 2 giggly fourth house teens who lowingly moan his name in mock dismay. Magnus offers a handshake. Gideon, painfully shy and bound by Harrow's silence, can only nod. Magnus, generously reading her hesitation as ninth gravitas, ushers the teens away. Wandering deeper into Canaan House, Gideon finds it a maze of rotting beauty, a chemical-stinking tiled pit, a corroded training room behind glass doors, and behind a sagging tapestry, a forbidding black stone door carved with horned skulls and serpentine columns, sealed by a keyhole sized for a thumb. She rehangs the tapestry to hide it again, a small ninth instinct that comforts her, and ducks into shadow as voices approach. Cor Ona Beth and Ianthe Tridentarius come down the stairs, bickering with their cavalier Naberius about whether the trial is cohort hazing or a protocol puzzle. As they pass, the pale twin pauses, looks straight into Gideon's hiding place, and softly warns the invisible ninth not to draw the attention of the third house. Gideon arrives in the dining hall an hour before anyone else, still unused to such a thing as midday meals, and finds herself alone with a plate of impossibly tender meat and a bowl of unfamiliar leaves she eventually decides must be a salad. She watches the skeleton servants more closely now, noting how flawlessly they have been raised, with none of the cheap tricks of pinned joints or padded tendons. Whoever made them was extraordinary, and she suspects teacher himself, which she knows Harrow will hate, since the ninth has always believed it alone had mastered perfect reconstruction. Her quiet meal is interrupted by 2 eighth house newcomers, a one necromancer boy in spotless white chainmail and his older weathered cavalier, who calls the boy uncle. The necromancer looks at Gideon with the same pure loathing she remembers from her old great-aunts and from the reverend mother and father long ago, and asks for the shadow cultist to be removed. The cavalier bows politely and asks her to leave, and Gideon, longing for a fight but bound by Harrow's orders, simply goes. Wandering up through damp brick stairs, she stumbles into a terraced garden under glass, where Dulcinea Ascends rests alone in a chair. Dulcinea, knowing Ninth Pennant's customs perfectly well, coaxes her into propping the chair, removing her sunglasses, and finally drawing her rapier. Gideon stands beautifully, just like a picture of Martia's Nonius, until Dulcinea quietly notices that Gideon's offhand is cupping the pommel as though it were a longsword. Protesilaus arrives, muttering only, "It's shut," and Gideon flees, knowing that without speaking a single word, she has already said far too much. After her near disaster on the terrace, Gideon spends 2 days almost entirely shut up in the Ninth's gloomy quarters, drilling with her rapier until the sweat smears her face paint into a leering mask, doing chin-ups on the rafter beam, press-ups until Dominicus paints her in bloody light. She is sore, and she is furiously lonely. Crux always said she was at her worst after confinement. Once, in the very early morning, she half wakes to see Harrowhark slip silently into the bedroom and out again before dawn, leaving not even a rude note behind. So when core owner Beth Tridentarius, Princess of Ida, strides into the breakfast hall like a lion and kisses the back of Gideon's knuckles, Gideon, starved of protein and attention, simply cannot say no. Corona has organised cross-house sparring matches, and she leads Gideon down to the freshly cleaned mirror room, where Magnus Quinn, Lieutenant Dyas of the Second, the Fourth's young John Mary Chaytor, and Naberius III are already gathered. Refusing to remove robe, hood, or dark glasses, Gideon faces Magnus first. He is warm, self-deprecating, plainly a little afraid of her, and the bout is over in 3 calm moves. She pivots his thrusts aside, contraparries his blade, and rests her rapier a 1/4 inch from his heart. Match to the 9th. Naberius, stung that his princess admires anyone else, demands the next fight. He is a different creature altogether. Clockwork perfect, narrow-shouldered with a very long reach, fighting from a sword's distance with bored, exact economy. Gideon's instinct is to slash through him with brute force, but in robes, with rapier and knuckle knife, she cannot. He toys with her, traps her blade in a hidden trident knife that splits into 3 prongs and flicks her rapier from her hand. Refusing to surrender, Gideon punches him hard in the solar plexus, kicks his leg out from under him, and rests her sword at his collarbone. Core owner Beth calls the match to the 3rd on the technical disarm. Dyas, watching coolly, delivers the verdict that will follow Gideon for the rest of Canaan House. Naberius is the better duelist, but Gideon is the better fighter, the one who fought to win. And, she adds gently, the 9th cuts too much. Naberius leaves furious, branding her a brawler and a cultist, a no-neus come again only in his mockery. As Gideon unbuckles her knuckles, still warm with adrenaline, some 6th sense draws her eye to the doorway. There stands Harrowhark, skull-painted and hooded, watching in perfect silence. For a long moment they look at one another. Then Harrow turns in a swirl of black and is gone. A full week has now passed at Canaan House, and Gideon has met nearly every adept and cavalier under that crumbling roof, though meeting here does not mean befriending. Most of the other houses give her a wide berth in the dim corridors, eyeing her painted skull face as though she might need a stake through the heart at midnight. Only core owner Beth greets her on a whim, and warm Magnus V keeps offering nervous remarks about the weather. Teacher, that ageless little priest, joins her at the occasional meal and cheerfully deflects every question put to him, implacably ignorant. The 9th's doorway now hangs with bones and fingerbone chimes. Ambiance, Harrow had written on a curt note, and ambiance it remains. Quietly, in the background, Dulcinea Septimus has begun to soften toward Gideon in her own gentle way, calling her over to fetch pillows or hold wool for crocheting, treating the supposed locked tomb cavalier as a person rather than a curiosity. She tells Gideon that she rather enjoys making a 9th House cavalier her scullion, and that one day she'd like to hear Gideon's voice. Then comes the unease. For 2 mornings, Harrow's pillow and laundry have not changed, which means she has not slept in their quarters for 2 nights running. Gideon, knowing Harrow would never abandon her own things to Gideon's mischief, concludes the reverend daughter must be hurt or stuck somewhere. With a resentful sigh, she begins searching the atrium, the dock, the terraces, even an entire eastern wing that turns out to lead, alarmingly, to the 8th house's door. Nothing. On a final impulse, she forces open a water-swollen door beside a broken lift, finds a cramped staircase, and descends into a corridor sealed off with caution tape, where one ribboned barrier has clearly been pushed through by other feet. The trail leads her out across the crumbled, vertiginous terrace. She has been here once before, and turned back from the height in queasy alarm. This time she presses on, climbs a spiralling iron stair clamped to the tower, and slips through an auto door into a dim, tiled lobby of lifts that no longer run. Voices drift up the staircase. 2 strangers, a calm-voiced young woman and a sharp, bone-dry young man muttering about scrying readings that make no sense. Gideon creeps closer, and the woman sees her first. This, at last, is a real warrior. Camilla of the 6th draws sword and offhand knife in one liquid movement and comes for her. And for the first time at Canaan House, Gideon finds herself fighting someone of her own caliber, blow against blow, knuckle-knife against dagger, exhilarated and outpressed in equal measure. Her necromancer breaks them apart with a shimmering thanagetic barrier, calling his cavalier off. This is Pal Amadis Sextus, gaunt and bespectacled and extraordinary, the 6th's master warden. He has been studying the metal hatch behind him, and he tells Gideon, without ceremony, that Harrow has been down there for 27 hours, that her intravenous blood is on the floor, and that the key on Gideon's iron ring is the one that opens it. Down they go, Gideon first, into a retro-tiled facility of laboratories, sanitizers, and a mortuary, marked with the faded benediction, "It is finished." In a cubicle in sanitizer, they find Harrow folded inside a cocoon of bone, hands bloodied, paint smeared, alive but unconscious. Pal Amadis, with the curative science of the 6th, reads her pulse and breath like a doctor and diagnoses simple dehydration and a fainting fit. As Gideon hoists Harrow over her shoulder, Pal Amadis offers one piece of advice. It is unbelievably dangerous down here, and she should stop splitting her forces. Then he declares himself, quietly, the greatest necromancer of his generation, and from over Gideon's shoulder, Harrow finally stirs and mutters, "Like hell you are." Back in the 9th's dim quarters, Gideon dumps the half-conscious Harrow on the bed and finds she looks worse in lamplight than she did down in the facility. Torn lips, cracked paint, a black rime of dried blood crusted under each nostril. Harrow's first words upon waking are a threat to kill Gideon if she's touched again, which Gideon receives with the weariness of long practice. What follows is the closest the two have come to a real conversation since arriving at Canaan House. Gideon, holding the keyring as leverage, demands answers, and Harrow, too exhausted to keep her secrets entirely, slowly begins to talk. She has spent her time mapping the entire building. 775 doors across 3 levels, with only 6 of them locked. She names 2 in particular, X-155, the access hatch into the sub-facility, and X-22, a door teacher pointedly refused to grant her permission to open, all while winking at her so theatrically she thought he was having a stroke. Beneath Canaan House, she explains, lies something pre-resurrection, a place of laboratories and challenges left intact by whoever built it. She has been triggering what she calls theorem models, and she has already lost 163 skeletons to a single laboratory construct she cannot even see. Gideon, finally interested, remembers the hidden black stone door she found behind the tapestry, and Harrow marks it on her map as X-203. Her bloody smile is dreadful. From here, Gideon takes her own turn to talk and quietly bargains a truce. She will go down into the facility with Harrow as her real cavalier, and Harrow, too tired to refuse, agrees, then quotes teacher's warning that the place is haunted by 10,000 million unfed ghosts, and that Gideon may die there or simply lose her soul. Despite Harrow's collapse the night before, she is no kinder the next morning. Before sunrise, she forces Gideon into the robe and full death's head paint, and the two creep through Canaan House like spies, pausing in shadowed doorways for long minutes at a time. They cross paths only once, with Ianthe Ascends, the pale third twin, drifting past with a book in hand. Harrow waits long after she vanishes before continuing, They descend the cold ladder into the sub-facility, but this time Harrow leads them past sanitizer to a door marked Laboratory 2, Transference and Winnowing. Inside lies a ransacked data center, and beyond it 2 smaller rooms, one called Imaging, the other Response. The puzzle hinges on a strange dichromatic glass pedestal. When Harrow lays her bare hand upon it, the glass folds around her fingers like a cage, and the response door opens to admit any moving mass of roughly 30 kilograms or more. She has already sent in 90 kilos of bone constructs, and everyone has been pulverized by something she cannot see, because skeletons have no eyes. Gideon's role, therefore, is to stand at the window and watch. What lurches out of the fog is dreadful, a many-limbed bone construct with sharpened radius bones for blades, and 2 green eyelights burning in its skull. Skeleton after skeleton is shattered, and Harrow soon begins bleeding from both nostrils. Watching her adept fail again and again, Gideon takes matters into her own hands. She trips a passing skeleton, steps over it, and walks into Response herself. The fight is brutal, but instructive. On Harrow's instruction, she closes one eye and glimpses at the edge of vision a soft gel of light gathering around the construct's joints, like iron filings drawn to a magnet. When the trial resets and the monster dissolves into the grate, Harrow at last reveals the real test. It is possession. She has been trying to ride Gideon's living nervous system, deafened and dazzled by the noise of a working body. The trial is winnowing, separating signal from noise. Triumphantly she declares she now knows the way through, and faints into her cavalier's foot. Back in their dark-panelled quarters, Harrow takes the time at last to explain what the response trial really is. The construct they faced is animated not by one theorem but by several, woven together like a tapestry, which is why it can regenerate. To unpick it, Harrow must find each weak point in turn and pull on the threads in order. She could do it in 10 seconds at arm's length, but the trial forces her to do it through Gideon's eyes, while Gideon also swings a sword and thinks loud cavalier thoughts. Gideon, who would much prefer a longsword, is told firmly that her two-hander is gone for good. Their planning is interrupted by John, Mary and Isaac shoving an envelope under the door. It is a formal invitation from Lady Abigail Pent and Magnus Quinn to celebrate their 11th wedding anniversary that very evening, with a softer handwritten plea from Magnus to come along. Harrow's first instinct is to refuse, suspecting a clever poisoning that would tidily eliminate several house heirs at once. But Gideon argues that staying away would look rude, that everyone will be there, and that they can learn a great deal from the politics of the table. Harrow gives in, mostly because Gideon wants dessert. As evening draws near, Gideon notices something almost unprecedented. Harrow, who has presided over ninth functions since childhood, is nervous, repainting her face twice and fussing with her bone earrings, snappish and pacing. At the dinner, the seating chart separates them entirely, with Gideon parked between Palamodes and John Mary, and Harrow stranded between Protesilaus and the 8th Smerne's uncle, opposite a smirking Ianthe. Magnus opens with a corny joke about every cavalier sharing the same middle name, which gets Cor Own or Beth honking into a napkin and breaks the ice. The food is good, the conversation revealing. Ianthe coolly recounts how Cor Own or Beth nearly killed her in the womb. Palamodes carries a teacup over to Dulcinea and looks at her in a way that quietly peels skin, the long-distance love he has nursed for years suddenly visible. Dulcinea murmurs to Gideon that the houses compete suspiciously for nothing real, and trails off before naming her conclusion. Harrow, meanwhile, has cornered Teacher in a corner of the room, asking quiet, focused questions. Afterwards, she sweeps Gideon out so abruptly that they forget to thank Magnus. In the stairwell, she explains the urgency. She overheard Abigail Pent asking Coelum the 8th whether he knew the way down to the lower floors, and he had said yes. The 5th is a serious competitor now, and Harrow gives them perhaps 5 hours before Abigail reaches the chamber herself. Back in the response chamber, Gideon and Harrow attempt the trial a second time. Gideon bites her tongue bloody to keep herself anchored, while Harrow rides her cavalier's senses, sinking deeper into frustration. Then quite suddenly the world sharpens. Gideon sees faint coronas of light haloing the construct's joints, and Harrow, riding behind her eyes, sees them too. She calls out each weak point in turn, left radius, tibia, mandible, rib, and finally sternum. Gideon strikes each one in order, and the bone construct comes apart cleanly, no limb regenerating once its theorem is unpicked. From the dissolving pelvis rises a small black box, and inside it lies a deep scarlet key, which Gideon adds to her ring. Harrow is genuinely astonished that Gideon could see the thanergetic signatures herself. That, she says, should not be possible. And then, very rare for her, Harrow looks at Gideon with open admiration, calling her something almost like Martyre's no Neas come again. Buoyant, they head back up the access ladder together, ready for the next door. At the foot of the ladder, they find Magnus Quinn and Abigail Pent lying broken and dead. Through the long, early hours, 6 necromancers take their turns trying to call back the ghosts of Magnus and Abigail Pent. Pal Amadis diagrams the scene in marker pen, while Camilla sketches it from every angle, the 6th quietly making themselves useful. Isaac and John Mary, half mad with grief for the guardians who raised them, open their veins until Camilla gently takes the knives from their hands. Harrow works the perimeter like a wraith, measuring her steps, and finally faints into a puddle of cooling blood. Gideon carries her away. The third twins kneel hand in hand, Cor owner Beth steady and clear, while Ianthe runs slick with blood, and unsettlingly bites pieces from Naberius for fresh tissue. None of it works. Then Sailas Octaciceron arrives with column and reveals himself as a soul siphoner, draining the life out of his own cavalier to power a raising. Coelum greys into stone. The torches dim, the cold deepens, and Abigail's corpse begins to shudder. Dulcinea collapses, and Protesilaus simply walks forward and knocks Silas senseless with one punch. From the top of the ladder, Teacher appears in unfamiliar terror, begging them to bring the bodies up before something else makes a home in them. Once the bodies of Magnus and Abigail were carried up and laid in the freezer, the 8 houses gathered around the dining table with cups of tea, looking very much as they had on their first day at Canaan House, only now with a body count. Captain Judith Duta Oss of the 2nd, ramrod straight in a scarlet cohort uniform, demanded they call in military enforcers. Teacher refused, citing the sacred rule against off-planet communication, but he conceded something far worse. Magnus and Abigail had been murdered, and not by anyone in the room. There were monsters at Canaan House, he said, monsters who had so far left the Guardians alone but might not always. When Silas Octaciceron quietly admitted he had told Abigail about the facility beneath the floor, he then turned and accused the 9th, who had been first on the scene. Harrow's reply was pure cinders, and the simmering quarrel pulled in the 7th, whose Protesilaus had earlier knocked Silas senseless. A quarrel now formalized into a duel between Colum and Protesilaus. Cor owner Beth, of all people, steadied the room, brokering a pact of no suspicion, and Palamudes proposed they proceed scientifically with an autopsy. And then, almost gently, Teacher offered one last revelation. He revealed that Ianthe Tridentarius had been carrying a 4th hatchkey all along, blindsiding both her sister and her cavalier. Isaac and John Mary swore to hunt whatever had killed their guardians, and John Mary begged Gideon for anything she knew. Gideon, gently, could only say she was sorry. Then Harrow drew her away, already racing the others toward the next locked door. The scarlet key they had won so dearly from the response chamber bore one telling detail: a small carving on its butt of dots joined by a line and 2 half-circles. Gideon recognized it at once. It was the symbol on the hidden black door she had found behind a tapestry, the one marked X203 on Harrow's map. Harrow nearly trembled with eagerness, and they crept down through Canaan House in the pre-morning quiet, pausing at every corner because the thing that had killed Magnus and Abigail was still loose somewhere in the building. At the door, Harrow made a small, unexpected concession. The keyring was Gideon's, and so Gideon must be the one to unlock it. Inside they found a study perfectly preserved in time, stained lab benches inlaid with bones, jeweled tools, a sword rack still holding 2 whetted rapiers, an ancient blowback carbine, and on the wall a group portrait with every face scribbled out in black marker. 2 beds sat within arm's reach of one another, a nightstand between them holding an old watch, a silver bracelet, a second house seal. A book on the shelf was inscribed, "One flesh, one end. G and P. Harrow found the prize." 2 stone tablets fused to the wall, etched with the completed transference theorem, the full methodology for the utilization of a living soul. She began copying it down in feverish handwriting. Gideon, walking the room, mourned Magnus aloud, and Harrow surprised her by saying she could no longer accept being a stranger to her cavalier. They agreed to sleep on it. Alone later, Gideon uncrumpled a torn note from beside the nightstand and read her own name written in a hand 10,000 years old. Just 9 hours after their discovery of the hidden study, Harrow rouses Gideon before dawn, paints her face while she sits half asleep over a bowl of porridge, and leads her back down the cold ladder into the facility. The torn note bearing Gideon's own name lies folded at the bottom of her pocket, and everything around her feels dark and strange, as though she's still inside a dream she half remembers. As they descend, Harrow finally explains what they're really doing here. The hatch key was only the warm-up. Beneath Canaan House sits a series of testing rooms, each replicating a particular necromantic experiment, and any postulant who carries the experiment to its intended conclusion is rewarded with a key. That key, in turn, unlocks the original lictor's study where the full theorem behind the trial is written down. Harrow has already absorbed the transference theorem and can now ride another living soul, but it's the construct's regeneration she finds even more interesting. Bone hunks that put themselves back together, the one outcome nobody really wanted. At the bottom of the ladder they find Dulcinea Septimus waiting for them, leaning hard on her crutches with Protesilaus hulking behind her like a mannequin with abs. Dulcinea proposes a partnership. She's identified one of the theorem labs she cannot physically complete, and she offers Harrow her full notes and first use of the key, asking only for the key back once Harrow is done. Harrow, suspecting that Palamedes would otherwise be approached and that he would accept, agrees. Dulcinea leads them down a parallel corridor to Laboratory 8, labelled Diversion, and, beneath that in fainter ink, the handwritten word Avulsion. Inside lies a long grey chamber barred by a yellow and black painted line, and 100 metres beyond it, a glass-topped plinth holding the prize. Anything that crosses the line is annihilated by 2 coterminous spells layered on the same bounded space, which Harrow calls theoretically impossible, a senescence field that ages organic matter to dust in seconds, and an entropy field that scrambles any magic trying to control the rate of decay. Harrow tries a corporeal ward, then a thick bone gauntlet, and both are eaten away as quickly as her own fingers were. Dulcinea finally explains the only known solution. Palamedes refused to do it, and so the 7th has come to the 9th as her second choice. The trick is siphoning, not soul siphoning, but thalagy siphoning. Harrow must anchor herself to a living source on this side of the line and drain that life force to power her wards as she crosses. Dulcinea, dying herself, could only sustain a person for about 10 metres. Harrow draws Gideon out into the corridor and explains the cost honestly. The second house is famed for the reverse technique, and its victims are said to die screaming. Gideon agrees anyway, simply because Harrow asked, and quietly admits that this is all she has ever demanded. Back inside, Harrow rests her hand on Gideon's pulse and steps across the line. The pain is immediate, and beyond anything Gideon has known. Her jaw lights up with starbursts, her nose floods with blood, her heart staggers, and she collapses against Dulcinea, who cradles her head in her lap and murmurs over and over how sorry she is, telling Gideon she is too young, that this is cruel, that none of it is worth what they take from her. Gideon screams without realizing she is screaming, fights the constant urge to throw Harrow off and break the connection, and barely holds long enough for Harrow to reach the plinth, retrieve the prize, and stumble back. When Gideon comes to, she finds Harrow kneeling beside her, entirely naked, her robes eaten away, her hair shortened, her eyelashes gone, and most disorientingly of all, her face washed clean of paint for the first time Gideon has ever seen it. Harrow refuses to let Dulcinea touch her cavalier, and walks Gideon back through the silent halls with awkward gentleness. the plain silver key now hanging from the iron ring beside the hatch key and the red response key. Before Gideon collapses into sleep, Harrow lets slip the thing she will not name. She must become a lictor now, she says, and bites the word off like meat from a bone. Gideon, too spent to ask what comes after that word, obeys for the first time without compunction when Harrow tells her to rest. Gideon wakes in the late orange light, feeling cramped with hunger and weak as a kitten, the corridors of her own body still echoing from the night before when Harrow drained her life force across the entropy field. A series of escalating notes from Harrow forbids her from leaving the quarters or coming to find her, and promises that Pal Amud's sextus will be sent to check on her, which by itself tells Gideon how badly Harrow has been frightened. The visitor, however, is Camilla the Sixth, brusque and efficient, who examines Gideon with thermometer and pulse and notebook, and pronounces her impossibly healthy. When Gideon asks why Palamedes had refused to perform the siphoning spell for Dulcinea, Camilla explains rather quietly that he could only have managed it at the cost of her permanent brain damage, and adds that the 8th house doesn't truly train cavaliers at all. It breeds them as genetic batteries for their necromancers, which is why Suilas could have done the spell so easily. Camilla helps Gideon to the dining hall, where they find a sleep-rumpled core owner Beth pleading with teacher and Palamedes for any spare facility key, certain her sister Ianthe is already moving ahead of her. Palamedes finally tells her the truth that Harrow had quietly confirmed with him after the 5th's deaths. Each key is unique, all but 1 or 2 have already been claimed, and there will never be enough lictorhood to go around. Teacher gently confirms there is no rule against alliances, theft, intimidation or murder, because Canaan house lies outside imperial law. Captain Terrace of the 2nd hears this in chilled silence and withdraws her house from the table without a word. Pal Amades then leads Gideon and Camilla through the cooling larder into the small impersonal morgue, where he uses 6th house psychometry on Magnus Quinn's wedding ring and clippings from his pockets, hunting for the thanagetic trace of Magnus's missing facility key. He warns Gideon, kindly enough, that the gentler phase of the trial is over, and that Suilas has already begun targeting Dulcinea precisely because she holds 2 keys. Then, against Camilla's caution, he tells Gideon what the wounds on Magnus and Abigail truly showed. Extraordinarily tiny bone fragments from many different osseous sources, the unmistakable signature of a bone construct attack, never the simple fall it had been made to look like. As he says it, a door wheel turns softly in the cooler beyond, and a hem of blue 4th house embroidery flickers out of sight, listening and quietly fleeing. Harrowhark still hadn't returned by evening, so Gideon filled the strange tub in the bathroom with hot water and sat in it up to her chin, feeling, for the first time since arriving at Canaan house, something like peace. She slept 9 dreamless hours and woke to find Harrow finally back in her own bed, curled beneath the pillows, grumbling that the white key had gone to Dulcinea Septimus as agreed. Wandering down to the atrium, Gideon was waylaid by Isaac Tet RS, hollow-eyed and shaking, who said only that John Mary wanted her and that someone was dead. He led her to the great steel incinerator on a back terrace, where John Mary stood pacing with her rapier drawn. Inside lay a heap of soft grey ash. Corona and Nabirius arrived dripping from a newly filled swimming pool, with Dyas and Coelum behind. Coelum, raking through the remains, confirmed what the 4th teens already feared. This was rendered fat and flesh, not powdered bone. Nabirius dismissed the whole thing as 4th house theatrics, which earned him a vicious wish from John Mary that he end up in the incinerator next. Isaac murmured that he'd been seeing things at night, hearing someone outside their door. The cavalier and necromancer pair had been warning Gideon and Corona Beth specifically, because Magnus had liked them both. Left alone with Gideon, Corona finally admitted aloud that they were in real trouble, then noticed, with a delighted smile, that Gideon was a ginger. That afternoon, a heavy storm broke over Canaan house. Camilla Hecht appeared with cold news. The duel was off. Protesilaus had never arrived. The 7th's quarters stood empty. They found Dulcinea collapsed on the wet flagstones of the conservatory, bluish-lipped and coughing pink foam, who whispered only, "He never came back," before fainting. With Protesilaus still missing and Dulcinea bedridden in the priest's wing, drowning slowly in her own lungs, the surviving houses gathered around a bowl of incinerator ash like guests at some grim party. Ianthe Ascends, cool as ever, identified at least 2 people in the remains, perhaps 3 months dead, which meant they predated the postulant's arrival entirely, and so were not the missing Protesilaus. Harrow watched Ianthe with that diamond focus Gideon had come to recognize, the look she wore when reassessing a threat. Then Silas Octa Ciceron slipped back in, pale and pitiless, and revealed he had visited the dying Dulcinea and persuaded her to surrender her white and grey keys for safekeeping. His cavalier Colm locked them onto the 8th's ring with a final click. Captain Judith Due to Os decided this was the moment to act on what she had warned would come. Key hoarding had to end. She challenged Pal Amadeus, Sextus of the 6th, the Emperor's reason, demanding his facility key, and named the time as now. When Corona tried to have the 3rd stand in for the 6th, Ianthe quietly forbade Nabirius from drawing, an unmistakable sign that Nabirius, Babs as the twins called him, now answered to her and not to the Golden Twin. Pal Amadeus accepted under the brutal hyoid down rules, where strikes were legal anywhere below the throat. Camilla Hecht, looking more librarian than swordswoman in her grey shirt, stepped onto the table and detonated. She fought Lieutenant Dyas like a hurricane, took a rapier through the forearm, then dislocated the lieutenant's arm with a sickening pop and drove her face first into the boards. Pal Amadeus seized the second's key in cold fury, telling Judith she had hung a target on every keybearer in the building and made the whole thing a free-for-all. Then a new voice cut in from the doorway. It was Nabirius' turn, vaulting onto the table to challenge the wounded 6th for their keys, with Ianthe rising calmly behind him to back the play. Coron, Beth, you'll remember, had been the golden face of the 3rd all along, but here at last she crumbled, conceding the lead to her pale sister and whispering that she could do nothing. Captain Due to Os, still pressing both hands to Lieutenant Dyas's bleeding chest, tried to call it back to rules and order, but Ianthe coolly observed there were no rules in Canaan House any longer, only challenges, and how one answered them. Camilla, arm bound and reopening, hauled herself up for a second round all the same, until Gideon, finally sick of all of it, unsheathed her sword and silently begged Harrowhark to stand with her. And to her astonishment, Harrow rose to the moment, declaring in Crux's own sepulchral tones that the 9th would represent the 6th, death first to vultures and scavengers. John Mary leapt up to add the 4th's blade beside them, and Nabirius, suddenly outnumbered, sheathed his weapons with a sulky toss of his curl. Silas swept his cavalier out with cold contempt, vowing to hunt Protesilaus, which Palamadeus correctly read as door-trying with stolen keys. Once the room cleared, Palamadeus confided the real news. Only one facility key remained unaccounted for, and the 8 locked studies together formed a mega-theorem, the true path to lictorhood. They divided their forces. Harrow, Palamadeus and Camilla would guard the dying Dulcinea, while Gideon and the 4th teens descended to find Protesilaus. Gideon, on impulse, hugged Harrow goodbye, leaving her speechless, and went down. Gideon led Isaac and John Mary down into the facility in tense silence, the 2 4th House teens jumpy at every shadow, no longer the brash youngsters who had hero-worshipped her over breakfast. John Mary fretted that they had no permission to be there, and Gideon, trying to reassure her, only managed gallows humour about how they were boned already. Isaac, who you may recall had always been the cautious one, insisted on warding every radiating doorway with blood in his cavalier's spit, explaining that the 4th weren't cannon fodder. Wards were the first thing he learned, and next year the markings would be scarified onto John Mary's back when they shipped out to the front at 15. They searched the sanitizer wing, calling out for Protesilaus, finding only the dried gobbets at the bottom of the ladder and Harrow's old bloodstains. Isaac's sweat began to bead. He could feel something moving down there, something that wasn't a house or a ward, just a wrongness. As they retreated, The lights cut out in rhythmic booms, plunging the corridor into darkness. One panel flickered briefly back on, just long enough to show fresh dripping blood on the wall, spelling out the words, "Death to the Fourth House." Isaac, exhausted past his nerves, flared into a sun of blue-green fire, and there in the room ahead loomed a colossal construct, a praying skull face crowning a forest of teeth-stinger tendrils. Isaac, the careful boy, planted his feet and tried to unmake it with raw will. About 50 tendrils ran him through. Gideon charged through a hail of bone shards, tore the screaming John Mary out of the construct's grip, hauled her up the ladder, and locked them inside the X-203 study with the only key that fit it. John Mary wept until she slept, asking why Isaac had gotten stupid now of all times. Gideon, watching the rise and fall of her breath, accidentally dozed for perhaps 15 minutes. She woke to a soft drip, and to John Mary, speared to the mattress by 5 enormous bone shafts, the words, "Sweet Dreams," painted in fresh blood above her head. By morning, the 4th teens were laid in the morgue beside Magnus and Abigail, the adults who had failed to keep them safe. Gideon could not remember who had pulled the bone spears from John Mary, or who had carried her back. Only fragments remained, including Harrow calling her a dullard and a fool with all the old contempt of the Ninth House nursery, before turning on her heel and walking away. Gideon found herself in Dulcinea's whitewashed sick room, weeping quietly into her hands while the dying woman held her fingers and refused to offer false comfort. "There was nothing you could have done," Dulcinea told her gently. "Life is a tragedy," she said, "and death an absolute triumph because the dead are finally free of us." Then, with that same strange tenderness she had always shown Gideon, Dulcinea revealed she had seen through the disguise entirely. Gideon had never spoken the cavalier oath, one flesh, one end, because she had never been raised ninth at all. Rumbled, Gideon admitted, too tired to panic, yet Dulcinea only smiled and called her a cavalier worthy of a lictor, wondering aloud whether Harrow even knew what she had. Palamerdes walked in on their 2 close hands, and Gideon fled into the corridor, where she collided with Silas Octa Kisseron. He called her Gideon Nav, having spoken with the returned sister Glauricar before her death, and framed Harrow's house as her oppressors rather than her family. He invited her to tea, alone, without the daughter of the locked tomb. Gideon refused and walked away, but from that night on the nightmares came. Every death she had failed to prevent replayed itself behind her eyes, and once, perhaps only in dreaming, an unpainted Harrow sat in the dark, watching her with weary, cynical pity, and told her quietly to go back to sleep. In the cramped, blackout-curtained quarters of the 6th house, Palamerdes Sextus and Harrowhark Nonagesimus settle in to negotiate, surrounded by walls of flimsy notes, towers of books, and the watchful presence of Camilla and Gideon. Palamerdes lays out his theory once more, that lictorhood is a mega-theorem, 8 component spells synthesized into one, each lab challenge teaching one piece of the whole. Harrow holds firm to her rival idea that the true prize is a hidden source of thanagy tucked away somewhere in the inaccessible bulk of the tower. They trade jabs, mirror each other's bony postures, and finally strike a bargain. Palamerdes will share his complete theorem notes if Harrow helps him pick a sealed lictoral lock, the one matching the grey key Silas has stolen. While the necromancers spar, Camilla quietly confides to Gideon that she applied to be Palamerdes' cavalier at the age of 12, and that her true weapons are 2 short double-edged blades. Her words carry a quiet warning. The real fight, she suggests, has not yet begun. At the hidden door behind a faded portrait, Harrow finds the lock plugged with regenerating ash, the same self-healing matter as the transferal construct. She tries to draw it out and fails, blood sweat beading on her painted brow, until Gideon steps in, rolls up her sleeve, and offers herself as a battery. The siphoning is agony, but it works. Palamerdes watches with growing unease and tells Harrow flatly that this is neither good theory nor good morals. He tallies the keys aloud, 3 for the 6th, 2 for the 9th, though one is loaned to Dulcinea, 3 for the 8th through Silas's coercion, and one still missing entirely. Walking back together, Harrow forbids Gideon from visiting Dulcinea ever again, calling the dying woman a death sentence. The argument unspools into something far worse. Gideon admits she could not save John Mary. Harrow, cold and precise, tells her she is not part of the equation, that the trials test only the necromancer, that the Ninth does not need her for this pantomime, that she scarcely remembers Gideon exists half the time. Gideon, raw and shaking, says she would rather serve a dying Dulcinea than the living reverend daughter. Harrow walks away as though they had been discussing the weather, leaving Gideon alone in the corridor with the slow, certain knowledge settling inside her chest, that she has, at last, decided to betray her. Half an hour later, still raw from her fight with Harrow, Gideon presents herself at the Eighth's door, where a startled Colum lets her in only after she surrenders her sword and knuckle knife on his sworn oath of honour. The room itself tells you everything about the Eighth, stripped bare, mopped until it hurts, a single huge portrait of the Emperor as kindly master, watching from the wall. Silas appears, towel damp and unsmiling, and lays out his case while Coelum quietly braids his hair. First, the soft blow. Sister Glaurikar and Oartus are dead. Their shuttle exploded en route home, the same shuttle Gideon herself had planned to steal, and Glaurikar returned briefly as a revenant to unburden her grievances on the Eighth. Then the hard one. Vent bacteria, Sylas says, does not kill immunoefficient teenagers. The creche flu that wiped out 200 Ninth children when Gideon was one cannot have been an accident. He implies, quietly and relentlessly, that the Reverend Mother and Father slaughtered an entire generation of their own, sparing only Harrow, not yet born, and Gideon, who somehow refused to die. No scion of that house, he says, should be allowed to ascend. Then he asks for her keys, and when she refuses, raises his hand to take them by siphon. And here, finally, Colum breaks. He reminds his uncle that he swore on his honour there would be no violence, that he was engineered before Silas was even born to be the oath itself, not a weapon picked up and laid down as convenient. He hands Gideon's sword back to her cavalier to cavalier, tells her under his breath that the next time they meet, one of them will likely die, and lets her walk out into perfect, ringing silence. Reeling from Silas's revelations, Gideon wanders Canaan house in a daze, no longer able to smell the mould she has lived in for months. In the great atrium she finds Teacher slumped by the dry fountain, weeping softly that the filled pool downstairs is a terrible portent, that none of them ever intended any of this to happen. He apologizes to her as poor child, though Gideon is too numb to care whether he means her or someone else. Drifting onward, she finds Cor Onabeth alone in the training room, stripped down and sweating, drilling rapier and knife with shocking competence. Corona has been hiding real swordsmanship from everyone, and she ambushes Gideon with a genuine attack, breathlessly admitting she has always wanted to challenge her, and hinting it isn't Nabirius she means. Babs bursts in terrified, restrains her, and begs her not to do this, not now, confirming a third house secret deeper than key politics. Gideon retreats and goes home to empty Ninth quarters. In numb fury, she ransacks Harrow's wardrobe and pulls out a hidden polymer box. Inside, she finds the severed head of Protesilaus VII. In the cramped, flimsy-papered sitting room of the Sixth quarters, Gideon sat nursing her third cup of grey powdered milk tea, with Protesil Ows' severed head resting dead-eyed on the desk, while Palamedes peered into its spinal column for what felt like the millionth time. Camilla had vanished with 2 swords on her back, leaving Gideon to insist again and again that whatever happened, Harrow was hers to deal with. When Palamedes asked quite calmly what he would do if Camilla turned out to be a murderer, he replied without hesitation that he would help her bury the body, because one flesh, one end, and all that. And then, almost without meaning to, Gideon told him the secret she had carried for 7 years. How at 11, after Harrowhark had unlocked the forbidden locked door, she ran straight to Peliamena and Priam Hark to drop her childhood tormentor in the deepest possible trouble, and how she had pushed open their chamber door an hour later to find them, and Mortis, the Lord's Cavalier, hanging from the rafters, with Harrow standing among the kicked-aside chairs holding lengths of unused rope. Palamedes listened in perfect silence, then gently refused to let her own the suicides of 3 grown adults, offering a deadpan confession of his own, that by failing to murder Teacher the moment he arrived, he was equally responsible for the deaths of Magnus and Abigail. He gave her his word, sworn on Camilla, when she pressed the torn note with her name on it into his hand and asked him not to show anyone, not even his cavalier. Then Camilla returned with Harrow cuffed beside her, and Pal Amadis asked, almost wounded, why she had not trusted him. Harrow answered simply that she had suspected he and Dulcinea were working in concert. Together they gathered every surviving house into Dulcinea's sick room, where Pal Amadis formally accused the Lady of the Seventh of being a beguiling corpse, a body kept walking by deep flesh magic. Dulcinea, propped on cushions and stroking Protesilaus' preserved head like a doll, calmly admitted it. The seventh house, all its heads working in concert, had puppeted her dead cavalier so that their dying necromantic heir could compete at Canaan house at all. Pro had been killed in some accident before they even landed. Silas branded the act unholy and stalked off to guard the morgue with the head. Captain Terrace refused to let Harrow claim it by carrion right. Dulcinea then collapsed into a wet, drowning fit, and Pal Amadis, with terrible tenderness, kissed the back of her hand. As the others drifted out, Harrow's whole attention narrowed onto Ianthe Ascends, and Gideon, recognizing that quivering focus, followed her wordlessly into the corridor. In the corridor, Harrow simply said, "Follow me," and then, more gently, "Please." And that single word kept Gideon at her heels. They went down past the atrium, past the training rooms, and straight into the pool, where Harrow set a perimeter of skeletons against the doors and around the tiled walls, before stripping off her robes and stepping into the warm green salt water. It was, she explained, her mother's rule. The ninth house's deepest secret could only be spoken of when fully immersed in salt water, and Peli Am Enna had kept a hidden ceremonial pool for that purpose alone. Harrow told Gideon everything. She did not kill Protesilaus. She had found him already stabbed through the heart the night after the entropy field trial, dismantled the beguiling corpse puppet with the lightest push, taken the head, and fled when she heard footsteps. She had sent Isaac and John Mary down into the facility because she had panicked, because she had convinced herself Pal Amadis and Dulcinea were the real danger, and because she had thought she could spare Gideon a necromantic duel. She named her suspects, the Tridentari, Sextus, Octa Kisseron, the second, even Teacher, and then Gideon asked about the Kresh flu, the pathogen that had killed all the Ninth's children when she was a baby, and the silence stretched long enough to drown in. There had been no pathogen. Peli Am Enna and Pry Am Hark, and the great aunts had pumped organophosphate nerve gas through Dreer Burr's cooling system, killing 200 children from infancy to 18, harvesting the Thanagy spike so that Peli Am Enna could finally carry a necromancer to term. Gideon had been meant to die in it too. She had inhaled the gas for 10 full minutes, 2 cots from a vent, and simply hadn't died, which was why Peli Am Enna and Pry Am Hark had looked at her ever after with dread rather than contempt. Harrow then explained why she had needed to be born at all. At 10, she had unlocked the locked tomb, walked past its wards alive, and found a girl frozen in ice with a sword on her breast and chains running into the rock. And seeing that face, she had decided to live forever in case the girl ever woke. Her parents, finding the tomb opened, had calmly tied their own nooses and mortices, and a noose for Harrow she could not bring herself to use. When Gideon apologized, Harrow exploded with grief and self-loathing, calling herself a war crime, and Gideon her only friend. Gideon hugged her into the water and offered the cavalier oath at last. One flesh, one end. In bed that night, Harrow let slip that the shuttle bomb had been Crux's doing, not hers, a secret Gideon decided to keep. Pal Amadis leads Harrow, Gideon and Camilla up to the very top of the tower, to a third literal door marked with a fretwork of 3 rings joined on a line. The key belongs to the 6th by right, since Pal Amadis solved its challenge, but Silas Octa Kisseron took it from Dulcinea and will never hand it over. Pal Amadis proposes a workaround. He held the key once, and as a 6th adept his memory of it is essentially perfect. Harrow, reluctantly, takes a small nodule of bone, closes her eyes, and rides his perceptions the way she once rode Gideon's senses in the response chamber. Under her hand, the bone stretches and shapes itself into a key, 3 precise teeth and all. The lock clicks open. Inside, they find the lab of the lictor, who built the first house's servant skeletons. It is a slovenly disaster of sleeping bags, ring binders, and pinboards. Palomardes explains what he and Camilla worked out earlier. The skeletons are not constructs at all. They are autonomous revenants, fully intact souls bound permanently into preserved bodies, powering themselves with no detectable energy. Hideous corpses, he calls them, the inverse of the beguiling corpse. The theorem stone in the back is signed in the old way. 500 into 50. It is finished. Camilla opens a binder of candidate photographs left by a lictor named Anastasia. On one page, circled in black marker, is Teacher's face. Before they can absorb what this means, a fire alarm howls through Canaan House, and every skeleton in the building collapses to dust at the same instant. They race down. In the kitchen, the priest's skeletons have crumbled into piles of bone and sashes. In Dulcinea's sick room, the salt and pepper priest is dead in his chair, untouched. In the priest's corridor, the other ancient priest lies face down with arms outstretched as though he had been running. The pile of bones at the door has been trying to break through. Inside, they find Captain Judith du Terrace gut-shanked with a bone shard, her left arm withered, Lieutenant Dyas's body torn from her skeleton on the floor, and Teacher pinned with a rapier through his chest and a dagger through his throat. Judith confesses she came to call the cohort. Teacher attacked when he realized. The hidden radio reached the Imperial flagship. The Emperor himself is coming. Teacher briefly stirs, whispering that one of them has come back, then settles. Judith refuses rescue. She holds Marta's sword in her bloodied hand and waits to die beside her cavalier. As the survivors made their way back to Dulcinea's room, Silas Octaciceron and Colum intercepted them with grim news. The third house had defiled Abigail Pent's body in the morgue, and they had since vanished. In the chill of the morgue, they pulled Abigail's slab free. Her abdomen had been opened with a knife, leaving a fist-sized hollow on her right side. Palomardes eased his fingers into the wound, and his face went still. The cut had been made with Narbeer Turn's trident knife, and something had been hidden there for some time, long enough for the flesh to seal over it. 3 inches of metal, with a shaft and teeth, a key. Pent, ever the careful scholar, had completed a challenge the night of her anniversary dinner, and hidden the prize inside her own body to keep it safe. The third had simply cut her open to retrieve it. Silas calmly admitted he had hoarded the 7th's keys only to deny everyone else, never once opening a door. Colum identified half the incinerator cremains as Protesilaus' headless corpse. The other half remained nameless. They resolved to race the third before it was too late. 6 of them walked the dim hallways of Canaan House together. 3 necromancers, 3 cavaliers, stepping carefully past the fallen heaps of skeleton servants whose 10,000-year vigil had ended the moment Teacher died. Following Harrow's careful map, they reached the lictoral door whose lock had once been plugged with regenerating bone, and found it standing open, the key still in place. Inside, the room was unlike any laboratory they had seen before. It was light and airy, its walls painted long ago with white blossom trees and golden cloud-thick birds, though those frescoes had been defaced with fresh black paint a foot high, reading, "You lied to us." Coron Beth, Tridentarius, was huddled by a marble slab, rocking and weeping the dull, broken weeping of someone who had been crying for hours. Narbeer Turn lay sprawled and stiffening on the floor, a sword wound through his heart, and Ianthe sat reclined on a sagging cushion in the centre, her pale robes spattered with blood, her pupils blown wide, trembling so hard she seemed to vibrate, and she greeted them with the careless cheer of someone who had just won everything. She had killed her own cavalier, she told them, and then absorbed him. She had reverse-engineered the entire megatheorem without a single study, without any key but this one, because she was, she explained, the best necromancer the third house had ever produced. A liminal magician working in resurrection theory, hidden all her life behind the cover of an animophiliac. She walked them through the steps, almost sing-song, pin the soul with the sword, analyze it, absorb it, fix it, incorporate it, Take a drop of flesh, reconstruct and power the whole engine. Pal-am-Adis recognized it instantly as the calculation he had discarded as ghastly. Then Ianthe revealed the third's lifelong secret. Corona had never been a necromancer at all, and Ianthe had been carrying both their identities since they were 6 because their father wanted a match set. Silas Octociceron heard enough. He branded her heretic, sentenced her to death, and ordered Colum to execute her against the cavalier's quiet, anguished protest. Ianthe fought back, with Nabirius's exquisite swordwork moving inside her body, but her arms could not quite carry the weight, and Colum disarmed her until she shielded herself in a grotesque dome of her own flesh. Silas siphoned Colum near empty to break that shield, draining and draining until his cavalier greyed and stilled, and something else slipped into the hollowed body. Colum's head turned backward on his neck, his eyes became mouths, and the thing wearing him drove a sword through Silas's throat. Ianthe finally broke Colum's neck and dissolved the intruder, then warned them, almost gently, that there were worse things than herself in this building, before stepping into Silas's blood and vanishing. Corona collapsed into Gideon's arms, weeping not for Babs, but because Ianthe should have taken her instead. Out in the hallway after Ianthe's departure, Camilla quietly asks where Pal-am-Adis has gone, and then tells Gideon the secret she's carried in silence for years. Pal-am-Adis Sextus has been writing letters to Dulcinea Septimus since he was 8 years old when she was 15. He pursued medical necromancy entirely for her benefit. He became heir of the 6th partly to meet her on equal footing. A year ago, he proposed marriage so she could spend her remaining time with someone who loved her, and she refused, though not for lack of feeling. Gideon, hearing all this, understands at last why Pal-am-Adis was always so painfully tender around her own friendship with Dulcinea, and she runs to find him, desperate to apologize. She finds him standing in the corridor outside the sick room. Without a word, he folds his fingers like paper, and bone needles paralyze her where she stands. An act of mercy, not cruelty. He enters the room alone, leaving the door open so Gideon hears everything. Pal-am-Adis asks gently why the 5th were killed first, and the woman they all knew as Dulcinea admits the truth. Abigail Pent was a historian, and historians might recognize her. She confirms she killed Protesilaus aboard the real Dulcinea's shuttle, kept the dying Dulcinea for weeks, and then incinerated her once Protesilaus's puppeted body became inconvenient. She speaks of a plan 10,000 years in the making, drawing the emperor back without his remaining lictors so she can shatter his houses before his eyes. And then, very softly, Pal-am-Adis reveals what he's been doing the entire conversation. With 6th psychometry, he has been accelerating every disease in her stolen body, advancing her cancer, her lung infection, every quiet malignancy held static by lictoral renewal. He calls Gideon's name, tells her Camilla knows what to do, and detonates himself in radical thanagetic fission. Gideon flees through cold white fire. In the atrium she waits, and from the smoke walks Cytherea the First, healing as she comes, smiling, sword raised. And now comes the long battle in the atrium of Canaan house, where the trials end. Camilla Hecht, having just watched Pal-am-Adis detonate himself moments earlier, throws herself at Cytherea with all the fury of a cavalier whose necromancer has died. She fights so fiercely that Cytherea, the ancient lictor still wearing Dulcinea's face, can only parry, sprouting a shank of bone from her knuckles to meet the storm of knives. But a lictor knows tricks no mortal cavalier can answer. Bone spines coil around Camilla's wrist, pinning her, and the older woman begins to siphon her, drawing the very life out through her skin. And then Harrow arrives. The reverend daughter stands at the top of the stairs, her face painted in the old death's head of the Ninth, and she sows handfuls of bone like a farmer scattering seed across a field. From each grain a perfectly formed skeleton rises, and they pour down the steps in a relentless tide. Buried in this army of the dead, Cytherea loses her grip on Camilla, and Harrow tosses Gideon her real sword, the heavy two-hander she has trained with all her life, smuggled here in defiance of every rule Harrow once enforced. Then the great construct emerges, the same colossal many-legged horror that killed Isaac Tet Ares, rising through the broken floor at its mistress's call. Harrow stands beside her cavalier with blood already on her face and tells Gideon quite simply that they will bring hell. And they do. For the first time, they fight as one, Harrow riding Gideon's senses just as she did in the response chamber, telling her precisely where each strike must land. And together they discover what Harrow has actually been working toward all this time. She has cracked perpetual bone. Skeletons hurl themselves into the wounds Gideon carves into the construct's legs, dissolving into a hot, silvery lahar that sheathes each limb in a cocoon of self-healing bone, pinning the great beast to the floor. Harrow declares she has bested her father and her grandmother and every necromancer ever taught by her house, then quite cheerfully passes out. But the fight is not over. Camilla, dragged free of her own wounds, has cornered Ianthe Ascends with a knife to her throat, only to find the lictor's skin will not yield. A bone barb pierces Camilla's shoulder, and Ianthe Ascends raises her sword to finish her, and then a blade comes through Ianthe Ascends' belly from behind. Ianthe Tridentar has arrived, the third twin, freshly ascended, wreathed in pale, colourless hair, smiling and calling Ianthe Ascends old news. The two lictors begin to duel, and it is a duel quite beyond anything mortal eyes were built to follow. Swords moving in shockwaves of ash and aerosolized bone, floors cracking, walls falling outward onto the terrace. Gideon gathers Camilla and the unconscious Harrow and staggers outside into the sea wind and sunlight, and out there the battle reveals Ianthe Ascends' secret. The wounds Pal Amadis inflicted with his accelerated psychometry never truly healed. She only skinned them over because she lacked the thallogy to do more. As Ianthe lands fresh strikes, the old damage reopens beneath them. But Ianthe Ascends is the older and crueler lictor still. She catches Ianthe by the throat and siphons her almost to nothing, draining the very colour from her eyes, healing herself entirely. Then, almost gently, she cuts off Ianthe's right arm above the elbow and explains that an inadequate lictor makes a perfect everlasting battery. She turns then on Gideon. There follows a small, brave, doomed duel, Gideon with her beloved two-hander against Ianthe Ascends' pearl green rapier, and for a few moments Gideon fights like the girl she was on Drear Burr, full of Glaminae's old training and her own stubborn fury. But when she lands her perfect overhand cut, the blade simply bounces off Ianthe Ascends' collarbone, and the lictor catches her next thrust in one delicate hand. It is Harrow, swaying out of the rubble with two enormous bone giants beside her, who buys them one last reprieve. She raises a 6-inch shell of solid bone over the three of them, blood streaming from every pore, and inside that small dark shelter she and Gideon finally have the conversation neither of them ever expected to share. Harrow apologizes. Harrow tells Gideon she is the greatest cavalier the Ninth has ever produced, the best of all of them, and that it has been her privilege to be her necromancer. Harrow's plan is for Gideon to break out into the sea and survive. But Gideon, looking around at the dead leaves and the cracked flagstones and the bent iron spikes of an old herbaceous border, finally understands the mega theorem in her bones. There is no her without Harrow. One flesh, one end. Pretending to be calm, she lines herself up, tells Harrow she will know what to do when the moment comes, opens her doors at last to the whole quiet ancient house she has always belonged to, and with a cry of "for the Ninth," she falls forward onto the iron spikes. And so Harrow rises, with Gideon's voice now living quietly inside her own head. Together, almost gently, they finish what's left of the great construct, Harrow seeing the bone clearly at last, and sending the half-shattered thing tumbling off the terrace into the sea. Gideon then takes up the longsword in Harrow's noodle-thin arms, guiding her cheek to cheek, fingers wrapped around fingers, teaching her in these last few minutes how to truly hold the blade. Harrow weeps, says she cannot conceive of a universe without Gideon in it, and Gideon, ever practical, tells her to suck it down. She has carried 200 dead children of the Ninth already, and she can carry one more. They turn to Ianthe Ascends, who watches them with quiet wonder, and they duel. It is not a fair fight. Through Gideon's borrowed eyes, Harrow can see the cancer Pal Amadis accelerated, swollen and straining inside Cytherea's chest. Gideon's voice softens, fades to the edge of hearing, and quotes the old vow of Ruth as a farewell. Harrow drives the blade through the tumour, and Cytherea, after 10,000 years of slow dying, sighs in relief and is finally allowed to go. And so, the book closes quietly, aboard a ship far from Canaan house. Harrowhark wakes in a sterile white room, wrapped in a thermal blanket, with the deep black of space beyond the window. Sitting beside her, taking gentle notes on flimsy, is an ordinary-looking man with oil-slick rainbow eyes, the king undying himself. Harrow knows him at once, falls to her knees and begs him to give Gideon back. He refuses kindly. Gideon's soul is fused inside her now, and pulling it out would destroy them both. The Emperor confesses his own failure. Cytherea, he says, was the best of his lictors, broken by 10,000 years of pain he should never have asked her to bear. Then comes the survivor list. Ianthe Tridentarius lives, minus an arm. Camilla, Judith, and core owner Beth are simply gone, unaccounted for. Gideon's body could not be recovered at all. The Emperor offers Harrow a choice: return to a renewed Ninth or follow him as his new hand. Harrow accepts, not from loyalty, but to one day return for Gideon and for the others. And the Emperor names her at last, Harrowhark I. And so, we leave them there, for now. Harrowhark, alone in a sterile shipboard sickbay, with the soul of her cavalier folded somewhere inside her own, unable to be undone. Gideon, in a sense, still with her, and in another sense gone entirely. It is a quiet, complicated ending to a rather extraordinary tale, isn't it? Two girls who spent 18 years loathing one another, bound together at last in a way neither could have chosen, nor quite refused. We walked a long road tonight, you and I, from the cold landing field of the Ninth, where Gideon laced her boots for the 87th time, all the way to the drowned terraces of Canaan house, where everything she thought she knew began gently to come apart. We met Glamanae, with her wooden leg and her quiet kindness, Dulcinea, frail and laughing in her chair, Magnus Quinn with his warmth, and the third twins with their sharp little tongues, and underneath it all, that black horned door and what waited behind it. There will, of course, be more to tell. The Locktomb saga carries on, and Harrow's strange new life as a lictor is only just beginning. So, if you'd care to walk further with us, another book, another long, quiet evening, do consider tapping the subscribe button whenever it next suits you. No rush, of course. It will be there in the morning, just the same. For now, though, let the story settle where it has settled. Let drear Burr's bones rest in their niches. Let the sea around the first house grow calm. There is nothing more to attend to tonight, nothing to puzzle over, nothing that cannot wait until the light returns. Thank you for keeping me company through all those hours. It was rather lovely having you here. Close your eyes now if they aren't already closed. Let your shoulders soften, let your breath slow. The story is finished, and you are exactly where you ought to be. Sleep well, dear listener. Sweet, gentle dreams, and until next time, rest easy.